Dear hosts, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, the title of my lecture for today is not taken off the hat. It reads from a poem written by Yeats, the famous poet Yeats. And that very verse says, in my opinion, a lot about the tension between the past and the future. The verse reads like this: the future has the flavor of the past, which means that whenever we look into the future, something from our past comes to the fore and takes us into the days following our present with that very tinge of past that makes us understanding what is happening and what will happen. This very verse stays at the top of a book written by a famous cultural critic who delved himself into cultural diplomacy and cultural dialogue for almost 3 decades. His name, since he passed away some years ago, his name is Tony Judd. He was a distinguished professor at the New York University and the founder of the so-called Remark Group, whose member I was for almost 5 years. This group assembled young individuals from all over the world, from Europe, from North America, from Africa, from Asia, into a bunch of thinkers worth 20, 25 people, who were on a yearly basis taken into seclusion for 2 weeks with no other meal than physical meal and no other things to do but to interpret the world. And what was at the end of those couple of weeks of dialogue between ourselves and in the midst of closed walls, that was the report that was then filed to the University of New York and to other capitals of the world. Tony Judd wrote several books who are of most importance for me today, since I need to recall them to your attention. In one of them, whose title is Thinking the 20th Century, Tony Judd tries to rewind the meanings of the century that passed, making a difference between European history and European memory. History and memory are 2 ways of containing our past. Memory is what we keep in mind. History is what we interpret in a most logical and profoundly rational way. And the author says the following: replacing history with memory is dangerous. He plays on behalf of history. History should be taught in such a way that there will be an ethical meaning at the end of it, while memory itself is ready to lead us into deception. We have different kind of memories, mostly individual or group memories, whereas history is usually only one. May it be a legal history, may it be illicit history, may it be a state history, or may it be an academic history. While memory is based on impressions, on subjectivism, history tries to reach objectivity. One of his points deals with the narratives of national suffering throughout the 20th century. And he thinks that confessions religions of all kinds have become causes of sufferance throughout the 20th century simply because they were ready to offer very consistent narratives of suffering. Without history, Tony Judd says, memory is open to abuse. Without a structured lecture of confessions and religions, memory is open to abuse. This very phrase of Tony Judd hides in its midst a very interesting phenomenon. How much of the 20th century destruction, wars, profound fractures, pains, wounds have been caused by religion, have been caused by the wrong interpretation of the Word of God. And Tony Judd explains the First World War, the Second World War, in the following terms. The world has become deaf to the word of peace. For as long as the word of peace is assigned to be the word of God, the 20th century, because of its profound rationality, has taken himself away from the ethical meaning of religion, thus putting his own soul into the hands of destruction. This situation is treated by history and by historians in a very rational way, whereas memories treats this situation in a very emotional way. Historiography, addressing the First or the Second World War, is filled with numbers, with figures, with proven facts and relevant details, whereas the memories referring to the First and the Second World War are explaining the human causes of destruction and death. In none of those phenomena is or should be, whereas it does not exist, a reference to religion. Some very few years ago, one distinguished historian from the University of London, his name is Norman Davies, tried to see whether there is an ethos of European nations who would allow European nations to start war between themselves, not respecting religion per se. And his conclusion was the following. In none of the most important conflagrations of the 20th century was there any word addressing religion. None, that is, nor in the rhetorics of the principal leaders of the time, nor in the rhetorics of the principal military leaders of the time, and no word about God and therefore about ethical built peace in the conclusions of the diplomatic treaties following the wars, may they be in Versailles or in Potsdam. This elimination of religion from any reference addressing the 20th century, the century of destruction, makes again Tony Judd, and I quote him now, write in his post-war, in a book called Post-war, the following. Europe might be united, but European history and soul remain deeply asymmetrical. Asymmetrical not in reference to the West or the East, but asymmetrical in reference to religion. Whereas all Europeans want to be together, the European history, and mostly the 20th century European history, divorcing from religion remains deeply asymmetrical. What are those two historians calling for, both Tony Judd and Norman Davies? Accepting what Christian faith usually teaches us to do, that is, responsibility about what Europe was through in the past century. And we can then infer further on that if anyone becomes or wishes to become a European, then should accept himself as responsible for Europe's history as a whole. This mingle between history, memory, and the absence of religion throughout the 20th century gives us the following, gives us an incentive to ask the following question. Is there any reason to think that the 21st century should have a different chance in terms of its connection with religion? We all think that it should, but could it be? How much of our popular politics are linked with the basic principle of faith? May they come from Christianity, may they come from other books addressing the Word of God. Basically, in this world, none yet. So, if the future has the flavor of the past, this is not good news. The past is the 20th century, and the future is the 21st. If Yeats can be contradicted, then certainly something should be done. These were my few words addressing the distinguished audience.